A new report warns that China's military is developing a real and growing ability to hit the Australian mainland with missiles. The foreign policy think tank, the Lowy Institute, has also warned that China can already threaten Australia's trade routes, subsea cables and critical infrastructure. Here's Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Dziedzic. Stephen, before we get into the details, does this report say anything about the prospect of conflict with China, or is it simply focused on what its capabilities are?
Yeah, it's simply focused on the capabilities that China has, Gemma. So it's important to note here, this report is not predicting war between Australia and China or predicting a conflict which is going to draw Australia into a broader conflict with China. And it's not saying anything about the trajectory of the relationship. So this is not a report that says war is coming and that these strikes on Australia is inevitable. What it is an analysis of what China could do to Australia if there was some sort of conflict between Canberra and Beijing. Now, of course, this is pretty standard for analysis, of this type, but it can be confusing for people who aren't sort of familiar with it. So it's worth just laying that out at the outset. This is not saying war is inevitable, but as the author Sam Roggeveen puts it, capabilities take decades to build up, or years at least, but intent can change very quickly. So he says it's important for Australian policymakers, but also Australians more broadly, to be aware of the capabilities that China can now field and what they could do if there was a conflict.
Yeah, so what sort of weapons has China been developing and how could they use these against Australia, of course, if there was a conflict?
Yeah, look, the Chinese military build-up has been phenomenal. The government here in Canberra calls it, the biggest military expansion since the end of World War II, perhaps even beyond that, and by all accounts, that's accurate. What China can already do, before we get to these future capabilities, is already pretty formidable. We saw that with the Chinese Navy's circumnavigation of Australia last year, where you've got some very formidably armed ships with the capacity to hit the Australian mainland, essentially circumnavigating Australia. As the authors point out in this report, China already has the ability, if it wants to do things like hit Australia's critical infrastructure with cyber attacks. It's got the ability to use its navy and to strike the Australian mainland if it wants to. It's also already got long-range conventional missiles, which, if they were put on some of its features in the South China Sea, could, in theory, hit the northern parts of Australia. Not most of the Australian mainland, but northern Australia certainly. So it's already got formidable capabilities. What this report really goes to, though, is what it could do if it continues on its current trajectory. And basically, what China seems to be doing is it's developing the ability to project power further and to hit targets further afield. So, for example, two things that Australia's watching very closely is whether China develops a new long-range bomber. That's one of the things that the Pentagon and others have said it's close to doing. In theory, a long-range bomber like that could reach Australia. There's also been a lot of speculation about its ability to field long-range drones, including potentially drones with offensive capabilities that could reach Australia. Now, that's not imminent. That's probably at least a decade away, but that's another thing that this report says is a real and growing capability that China seems to be developing. And then, of course, Gemma, there's the prospect of a Chinese military base in this region, something that the government believes Beijing is intent on developing. As this report lays out, if China did get some sort of military foothold in the region, then that would dramatically change Australia's circumstances, because it would be able to use the abilities that it already has and the platforms it already has to strike the Australian mainland. So plenty for people here in Canberra to chew over.
Yeah, and what other impact does this military build-up have for Australia's place in the region?
Yeah, it's not just the fact that Australia is now facing the prospect, if there was some sort of conflict of China striking the Australian mainland. The Chinese military build-up, it also has other strategic impacts, and in particular, the fact that China's military balance of power, or the balance of power, is tilting in China's favour in this region has strategic implications for Australia, because what Beijing is challenging is essentially the old security order where US military supremacy, guaranteed a level of stability. And of course, as the report points out, if Southeast Asian nations are increasingly able to be coerced by China as a result of this military build-up, then that security guarantee from America loses its credibility quickly, and it allows China to build its own regional order, which effectively excludes not just the US, but also US allies like Australia. So it renders us increasingly marginal or irrelevant. So that's one of the reasons why the government wants to strike this so-called equilibrium, or this balance involving countries like Japan and the US, as well as other partners, to balance out Chinese military power. What this report makes really clear is doing so is a formidably difficult task, simply because of the scale and magnitude of China's military build-up.
Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Dziedzic, thank you.